I should probably start by telling you who I am. My name is Linda Carter, and 3 weeks ago, I buried my husband, Tom. We had been married for more than 40 years, and I thought I knew everything about the man who shared my breakfast table, who folded his newspaper the same way every morning, who kissed me goodnight without fail. But grief does strange things. It doesn't just bring casseroles and condolences. Sometimes it delivers secrets you never imagined. When I went through Tom's office to collect his personal belongings, I found a set of keys hidden in the back of his safe. Heavy, old keys on a plain ring. They weren't for our house, and they weren't for his office. For years, Tom had kept them locked away, out of sight, as if the weight of that metal carried the weight of his conscience. I knew exactly what those keys belonged to. A cabin in the mountains. A place Tom had forbidden me from visiting since the day we married. He always had the same excuse. He said it was nothing but a rundown fisherman's retreat. No running water, no cell service, a place he went once a month for solitude and trout. You'd hate it there. He told me more than once. I never pushed. After all, every third Saturday, like clockwork, he would pack his bag before sunrise, give me a gentle kiss on the forehead, and disappear until well after midnight. For 8 years, I accepted it. I even looked forward to those quiet Saturdays when I could spread my quilting across the living room, eat ice cream for dinner, and watch my British mysteries without hearing his commentary about how unrealistic they were. I never questioned. I never doubted. Because why would I? Tom Carter was predictable, steady, and utterly devoted. Or so I thought. But grief cracks open the walls we build. When I held those keys in my hand, I felt the first sting of betrayal. Every excuse he'd ever given me about fishing trips, about solitude, about roughing it in the woods suddenly seemed too neat, too polished. And I began to wonder, had my husband been living another life for 8 years? Right under my nose, I told myself I might never know the truth. I could have dropped those keys back into the safe and closed the door forever. But curiosity has always been my curse and my compass. That was the moment I decided I would drive to Cedar Ridge and unlock the door Tom never let me touch. And that's where the story really begins. Tom was always a man of habits. He wore the same kind of pressed shirts, rotated his ties like a calendar, and started every morning with black coffee and the crossword puzzle. There was comfort in that predictability. I used to tell myself that a man who measured out his sugar with such precision could never lie, could never betray. It felt safe, almost boring, but in the kind of way that lets you sleep well at night. And truthfully, I didn't mind those fishing Saturdays. At first, they felt like a gift. Once a month, I had the house to myself. I'd spread my quilting across the sofa without worrying about him tripping over fabric. I'd eat dinner straight from the carton, or order Chinese and let the cartons pile up on the counter. I'd watch my British detective shows without hearing his muttered complaints about how every suspect looked guilty. For a few years, I welcomed the quiet, and I thought it was harmless. But over time, little cracks began to show in his perfect routine. His fishing clothes smelled faintly of lavender, not of bait or river water. Once, I found a receipt for imported cheese tucked into his jacket pocket, the kind of specialty item Tom never bought for us. There were fresh flowers in the trash can the morning after his trips, still clipped short with stems wet as though they had been recently arranged. He had explanations for everything. The lavender was from detergent at the cabin laundromat. The cheese was a gift for a friend. The flowers were from the church bazaar. His answers were reasonable enough that I swallowed them whole. But now, with those keys burning in my pocket, every one of his explanations sounded rehearsed. I couldn't stop replaying the moments I had ignored. the faint smile when he returned home late, the careful way he brushed sawdust off his shoes before stepping into the kitchen, the extra cash withdrawals from the ATM that never made sense in our budget. At the time, I convinced myself they were quirks, unimportant details in the life of a man I trusted. Grief sharpens memory in cruel ways. I started seeing all the signs I had brushed aside, and the picture they painted was darker than I wanted to believe. My husband had been slipping away one Saturday at a time, and I had been too grateful for my own peace and quiet to notice. When I called the cemetery office out of curiosity, just to ask about the flowers, I learned something that cut me deeper than any receipt or perfume. Tom had not only visited my parents' graves, as he claimed he had spent long stretches of time at another grave, one with the name Grace Lane etched into the stone, a name I had never heard before. That discovery turned my unease into urgency. Whoever Grace was, she was part of Tom's secret world, and I couldn't rest until I knew the truth. So I packed a bag, slid those keys onto my keyring, and set out for Cedar Ridge, where the cabin waited like a locked box daring me to open it. The drive to Cedar Ridge was quiet except for the sound of my own doubts. Every curve of the mountain road seemed to whisper questions I wasn't ready to answer. What if I found proof of another woman? What if the life I had built with Tom was just the smaller half of a bigger story he never trusted me to know? By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, my hands were trembling against the steering wheel. The cabin stood in front of me, not the rundown shack Tom always described, but a place that seemed to glow in the late afternoon light. Fresh paint, curtains drawn neatly in the windows, flower pots lined along the porch. It didn't look abandoned or neglected. It looked lived in. And that was my first clue that the truth waiting inside was nothing like the one I had been dreading. When the key turned smoothly in the lock, I felt my breath catch. I stepped into a space filled with warmth and color. The walls were painted a soft blue, curtains the color of buttercup yellow, a vase of fresh chrysanthemums set neatly on the table. This was not a fisherman's retreat. This was a home, carefully tended, every detail chosen with love. Then my eyes landed on the photographs, dozens of them, in frames across shelves and hanging on the walls. A young woman with kind eyes, holding a little girl with a toothy grin. The same faces again and again: birthday cakes, Christmas mornings, a school recital with paper butterfly wings taped to small shoulders. I didn't know their names, but suddenly they filled the space where Tom's fishing rods should have been. On the desk, I found a leather-bound notebook with Tom's handwriting inside. The words stopped me cold. He had written about Avery's school play, how proud she looked in her costume, how much her mother Grace would have loved to see it. Grace, the name from the gravestone, and Avery, the little girl in the photos. In that moment, the betrayal I had braced myself for shifted into something far more complicated. Tom hadn't been hiding a mistress. He had been hiding a daughter I never knew existed, and a granddaughter he had been visiting in secret for years. Grace had already passed away, and Avery was the child left behind. I sat in the quiet of that cabin, surrounded by their laughter frozen in photographs, and I felt my anger collide with grief. Tom had loved them enough to build a secret life, but not enough to trust me with the truth. And still, looking at that little girl's smile, I couldn't bring myself to hate him, because love was stitched into every corner of that cabin, and it was undeniable. I touched the petals of the fresh flowers, still cool with morning dew, and I realized this wasn't just a place Tom had visited. It was a place he had nurtured, a second home for the granddaughter he couldn't bring himself to introduce to me. I didn't yet know how deeply this secret would change me, but I knew one thing for certain: the story wasn't over. Someone else was still coming here, still tending the flowers, still filling the fridge, and I was about to meet them. I didn't have long to sit with the shock. Just as I was tracing my fingers over the frames, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. A car door slammed, followed by quick footsteps on the porch. My heart thudded as the cabin door opened without hesitation, and two people stepped inside as though they belonged there. The first was a woman, maybe mid-70s. Her silver hair pulled into a loose bun, her movements slow but practiced. And beside her was a girl, no older than 9, with a backpack bouncing against her shoulders and an energy that filled the room before she even spoke. She dropped her bag by the couch and darted straight to the photos on the mantel, like a child returning to a safe and familiar place. I didn't need introductions. I knew. The girl was Avery, the same Avery who smiled back at me from every photograph. And the woman, I would later learn, was Ruth, Grace's aunt, who had been raising Avery since her mother's passing. In that instant, the truth landed heavy. Tom had not only been living a double life, he had been doing it with care and commitment. Ruth and Avery had no idea who I was. To them, I was just a stranger standing in the middle of what they considered their space, a space that had been quietly held together by Tom's devotion. I felt anger rising in me again. Anger at Tom for not trusting me with this, for letting me walk into this world without warning. But then I looked at Avery. She was pulling a drawing out of her backpack, humming softly, pinning it to the fridge where others were already layered like wallpaper. It was the kind of ordinary ritual children have when they feel truly at home. And that's when I found the letter, tucked behind a photo frame, folded neatly in Tom's handwriting. His words were steady, apologetic, and aching. He admitted that Grace was his daughter, born before he ever met me. He admitted that Grace had died too young, leaving Avery in Ruth's care. And he admitted his fear that if he told me, I would make him choose, and he couldn't bear to lose either of us. His letter ended with a plea for forgiveness, though he knew he hadn't earned it. Reading those words while Avery decorated the kitchen with her art, I understood what had kept Tom silent. He wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting her. The question that pressed hardest on my heart was simple, but heavy now that Tom was gone. What would I do with the truth he had hidden that night? I couldn't sleep. The letter weighed on me, but so did the sight of Avery's drawings taped proudly to the fridge and the fresh flowers on the mantel. This wasn't just Tom's secret retreat. It was a sanctuary for a little girl who had already lost too much. I started piecing things together. The bank statements, the small withdrawals that Tom had always brushed off as fishing expenses, suddenly made perfect sense. Month after month, he had been quietly funneling money into keeping this place alive. He hadn't been buying bait and lures. He had been paying for a cabin, groceries, school supplies, clothes, everything Avery needed to feel safe and steady. And now, with Tom gone, all of that support had ended overnight. Ruth, with her tired eyes and careful patience, was doing everything she could on her limited income, but I could see the strain behind her smile. She was managing, but barely. That's when the truth struck me hardest. Tom hadn't left me just with grief. He had left me with a decision. Did I honor the life he had been quietly building here, or did I walk away, letting Avery and Ruth fend for themselves? The practical part of me calculated numbers. $800 a month, sometimes more. Over the years, nearly $10,000 annually. Money Tom had made sure never touched our joint accounts, never cut into our comfort. He had sacrificed quietly, and now the responsibility sat in my hands. But the emotional part of me, the part that watched Avery line up her crayons neatly on the coffee table, the part that saw Ruth struggling to hide her fatigue, knew this wasn't about numbers. It was about continuity, stability. It was about whether Avery would feel abandoned once again. This time, not by death, but by silence. I asked myself a question I had never been prepared to answer. Was I willing to carry forward a promise my husband never found the courage to tell me about? The answer wasn't simple. My heart was torn between betrayal and compassion, between my anger at Tom and my ache for Avery, and I knew whatever I chose next would define not only Avery's future, but my own healing. The first time Avery spoke directly to me, it wasn't with suspicion, it was with a question that cut straight through me. She asked if I was angry at Tom for keeping her a secret. Her voice was soft, but her eyes searched mine for something steady, something she could hold on to. I remember pausing because the truth was complicated. Yes, I was angry. Yes, I felt betrayed. But looking at her, this little girl who had lost her mother, who now clung to the memory of a grandfather she adored, I realized that my anger wasn't hers to carry. What she needed to hear wasn't about my pain. What she needed was reassurance. I told her, in my own quiet way, that I wasn't angry with her or even with what she represented. I was hurt by Tom's silence. Yes, but I wasn't mad at the life he had built here. And as I said it, I realized it was true. The weight of betrayal didn't erase the truth of love. Tom had loved Avery deeply. He had rearranged his life around her needs, and in that moment, I understood why. Avery nodded, almost as if she had been waiting for permission to believe it. She went back to her crayons, humming the same little tune she'd hummed earlier. But I could feel the shift. A door had cracked open between us, and that was when the next question came, one I wasn't prepared for. She wanted to know if I would keep the cabin, if I would keep showing up. The way she asked, with a seriousness far beyond her years, told me everything I needed to know. She had learned not to trust promises easily. She had learned to expect abandonment. Her question wasn't about walls or furniture. It was about security, continuity. It was about whether she could believe in another adult to stay when things got hard. That night, lying awake in the cabin's quiet, I thought about how many times Tom had promised himself in his journal that he would finally tell me the truth. And every month, he had delayed. He had been too afraid. But I couldn't be. Avery deserved more than fear. She deserved someone willing to step forward, even in uncertainty. And so, even before I had the words ready, I knew the answer forming in my heart. I wasn't walking away. After that night, I knew that my next step couldn't be half-hearted. Avery needed stability. Ruth needed support. And I couldn't let fear or resentment dictate the outcome of a child's life. I started researching what it would take to become her legal guardian. Papers, references, medical evaluations, it all felt overwhelming. But each form I filled out brought me closer to making the promise I had already made in my heart real. I thought about Tom again. All those Saturdays he had spent quietly in the cabin, not for leisure, but to nurture Avery. He had planned her life carefully, in secret, so she could have love, guidance, and a connection to her mother through him. And now, with his passing, I was stepping into the role he had hesitated to share with me. The first few weeks of the guardianship process were tense. I had to prove my health, my financial stability, my ability to care for a child at my age. I called doctors, friends, people who knew me well, and asked them to vouch for my reliability. Each conversation reminded me that love alone wasn't enough. Responsibility had to match it, and I was willing to rise to that challenge. Then came the real test, Avery's adjustment. The first night she slept in the spare room, I sat in the living room watching the clock, listening to the sounds of her breathing and the faint creak of the cabin floor. Her trust had to be earned. Her fears of abandonment ran deep, but I reminded myself that I had already made a choice. I would be here, fully, for as long as she needed. As the weeks passed, our bond deepened. We cooked together, shared stories, and slowly learned each other's rhythms. Ruth still visited, but now she could rest knowing Avery had consistent care. The cabin, once a secret world built by Tom, became a shared space where memories, love, and grief could coexist. I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't known in years, and Avery's laughter, her curiosity, and her small acts of independence reminded me why I had chosen to embrace this responsibility. Finally, the day came when the court granted permanent guardianship. Sitting in the courtroom, holding Avery's hand, I realized that fear and uncertainty had been replaced by something steady, something true. We had navigated grief, secrets, and difficult choices, and emerged with a new kind of family, a family that chose to stay together, even in the face of complicated beginnings. Driving back to the cabin that afternoon, I watched Avery run to her favorite spots, and I understood something profound. Sometimes the families we need aren't the ones we are born into. They are the ones we choose to protect, nurture, and love with all our hearts. And in that moment, I knew that choosing Avery was not just an act of responsibility. It was the start of my own healing and the continuation of a love Tom had quietly built for years.